The Twitter thing, to be honest, feels to me like you have a very rich kid playing in a playground and being very jealous that they can't play with that nice blue elephant, which this other kid has. So they're going to buy, well, it's not a blue elephant, it's a blue bird,
Bluebird. Yeah.
right? The little blue bird. So they're going to buy the blue bird because they can.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Joshua Carlson, co-founder of Propello Media. In today's Ask an Expert, I sit down with Pascal Finette. He is the co-founder of a consulting futurism firm called Be Radical. They help leaders and learners more readily navigate the future-changing conditions. And today, while that concept seems semi-nebulous to a lot of firms out there, he's going to give you real exercises that you can do to help plot out and help forecast what conditions may have an influence over your business, whether those are negative or positive. So let's jump in and hear what Pascal has to say. Pascal, I want to welcome you to our Ask an Expert show. Thank you so much for coming on today. I want to start first with Be Radical. It is the business that you have created, co-founded. I want to hear about the origin story because I'm just always a sucker for how a business is born from concept to actual implementation.
As every good business, I think it starts with, and by the way, amazing to be on the show and here to be here with you. And as every business, as a good business starts, I guess, it starts with a frustration. And my personal frustration was I've been doing a lot of work in the future forecasting, business industry, really thinking about the future and helping people to see the future a little bit differently. And two things stood out to me. One is there's an insane amount of hype, which is often not quite, founded.
Yeah.
The second one is I found that in many cases, we tend to tell people a version of the future. We get them excited about the future. We change their mindsets, but then we kind of let them hang. And we're basically saying like, okay, good. Now you have all this information, like AI will take over the world. Robots will rule us. Go do something, but please don't call me again. And those two things frustrated me because first of all, I've been in tech too long that I know that, technology takes a while to gestate, to like really come into its full fruition. So really like sussing out what is hype and what is real became a passion of mine. And then the other one was being an entrepreneur myself, helping entrepreneurs, helping leaders to take the next steps, like really do something actionable with this view of the future. So that's the gestation story for Be Radical.
Okay, and so you see this kind of disconnect between hype and what is reality. And I want to seamlessly jump into futurism because that's really your forte, but I feel like a lot of businesses kind of feel like it's nebulous, right? Mm-hmm. It's this kind of abstract concept. So aside from hiring Be Radical, which obviously is an option on the table, what can businesses do to kind of internalize and say, hey, okay, how can we get in front of this? Because I think we can all agree COVID was the mother of all disruptors. And I think we can argue about how much we could have forecasted its presence in the marketplace. Because I think there definitely were a lot of telltale signs. But for a business independent looking forward, what are your suggestions for a business to do?
Absolutely. Let me also preface this with the COVID discussion is an interesting one where, people like Bill Gates, the guy who's like putting these little trackers in the COVID vaccines into our bodies. That's a different story.
I'm familiar with him. Yeah. I might have a couple on me.
Yeah. And I mean, he and many others said like there will be a global pandemic. The problem with that is, of course, like nobody can tell you when. Yeah. And I think the pandemic is an interesting case because it really is an edge case where we could have known that it comes. We should have known that it comes. Some people did know that it comes, but it's impossible to predict because it's a freak accident. Okay. And you have some of those things where you say like, act of God, like weather, whatever it is, like, which is really hard to predict. Now, that being said, when you look at the future, particularly as it pertains to changes we see, for example, in technology, it becomes a little less nebulous. You can actually do predict. And for this, I think there's two pieces to take into account. The first is being able to see the future, actually opening up your eyes towards the early indicators of change, the weak signals, and thinking through what they could look like. My favorite example, and I'm dating myself here, is 1997. I very excitedly bought a Palm Pilot. Which many of us probably remember. Probably still have someone in like a drawer somewhere, like gathering dust.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it was an incredible device. Like you could suddenly take your address book and your contacts, etc., with you, which was amazing.
Yeah.
Now the challenge was, of course, twofold. One is when you look at a Palm Pilot today, and I actually bought one recently on eBay just because I wanted to have physically a Palm Pilot again, just to look at it.
Nostalgic.
Yeah, it's nostalgic, but it also, you look at it and you're like, holy crap, this thing looks like an iPhone, right? I mean, a very crude version of an iPhone,
Yeah,
make no
no,
mistake.
but fundamentally very similar.
Yeah, and it had apps and it had a touch interface and all these kind of things. But this is 10 years before the iPhone came out. So two interesting questions. One is, in 1997, as you were holding your Palm Pilot, were you thinking that this thing becomes the iPhone? And were you thinking through what the implication of that could be? And then the other question is, would you have thought that it will take 10 years? And that's a really interesting, starting point for this journey as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, to figure out, what do we actually need to think about the future? Twofold. One is being able to see those early signals. And quite frankly, in today's world, because it's so interconnected and is so hyped, it's actually not hard to see those because everybody screams into your face, like the metaverse, NFTs, crypto. The question then becomes to be thoughtful about this and say, okay, so which of those signals will actually turn into something real, and when will that happen?
And so you talk about weak signals, and I love this term because it's actually kind of a duality because they're very powerful if you can perceive them accurately. Let's talk about this. And I don't know the exact exercise. I've done a little bit of research with you, but you guys, or at least I saw you walk through this disruption map where you talked about, hey, here's the signal. Let's really vet out the way that these things happen. So walk me through what that exercise looks like.
Yeah, it's very simple. So this goes back, we haven't invented this. This goes back to a gentleman called Jerome Glenn, who 40 years ago invented this whole thing. He back in the day called this a implications wheel. Okay. And the idea is you look at a change.
Yep.
Let's say, for example, self-driving cars in the passenger capacity. And then you ask yourself, what are the implications of this? What will the world look like when this becomes real?
Right.
And there's a first order of implications, which, everybody can basically come up with. Like we can do this over, one of your lovely beers. And we can talk about okay, so, self-driving cars will lead to a world where you don't drive anymore because the car drives itself, right? And then you can say, well, you will have less accidents because the cars hopefully drive better than humans and they're not distracted and so on. So everybody can do this. And the brilliance of Jerome was to say, let's do more world building by asking ourselves the very simple question, what are the implications of those implications? So you actually ask, in a world where we'll have, for example, we don't drive anymore, what does this world then look like? And this is where you get into the more interesting stuff. And you basically follow this line of thought to its logical conclusion. So very simple, you sit in the car, you don't drive anymore, you can drink a lot more beer because drink driving isn't a thing anymore, right?
Right.
So and then you can ask yourself, well, if that's true, what does that mean? Probably we will see different behavior we have when we go out as a group, right? Yeah. We don't need the designated driver anymore.
Yeah, right.
Right. We might let our kids drink a little earlier because we're like, well, they're not stupid anymore and sit in a car and drive themselves, unfortunately, to death. But where it gets really interesting is, and just to walk you through one of those branches, which I find particularly unique.
Sure.
You look at cars, you sell self-driving cars, less accidents. Less accidents leads to less hospitalizations, less death. Now you can ask yourself, well, if I live in a world where we've got less people going to a hospital, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Well, if you run a private hospital, not a good time to be in that business, right? Right. It sounds funny, but it's an actual thing.
It's genuine exercise, right?
Yeah, and then you can take it really to its logical extreme and you will realize that in a world where you have less car accidents, the problem of the organ shortage problem is exacerbated because the massive amount of organ donors, particularly here in the United States, are young people driving.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
So it's an incredibly powerful exercise because what it does is it allows you to see at the edges the interesting true disruptions and the interesting opportunities. Of course, as an entrepreneur, you will pounce and say, oh my God, I now need to invest into growing organs in petri dishes, or growing pig farms where you grow organs, etc., etc. So it's an incredibly powerful exercise to really force yourself to sit down and think through what does the world actually look like when these changes materialize.
So I think this is fascinating from a couple different standpoints, and I'm really looking at this from two different directions. So as you go through that exercise of, saying self-driving cars, and you went through this, and now we're at organ donor, right? And so those are pretty extreme businesses. So if I, a business, am in the business of craft beer, which to our audience listening just over the audio, I've got a wall of craft beer here, but to that world, if I have this business of craft beer, do I start with what is the future of craft beer? Or do I need to take this exercise, because I think the self-driving car was a perfect example. Now I, as a consumer, can drink more when I'm going out, i.e. the business can sell me more. Or do you start with random ones and go out to this iterative process to find out, oh, there's an intersect over here because of this trend that we're seeing here?
That's an absolutely brilliant question. And the way I would approach this is twofold. One is absolutely do it in the core of your business. Say, for example, you're the craft beer maker. Yep. There might be interesting new technologies you're currently seeing in the way the beer is being made, the way the beer is being marketed, it's being sold, packaged, whatever it is. Those you can play out, and look at like, what does this actually mean for the core of my business? Mm-hmm. The things you typically don't see quite as well as, we talked about the self-driving car example, is the self-driving car, like the impact a self-driving car or even an Uber economy where everybody where people don't own the car anymore, but we call a car. We all have a private chauffeur essentially. Yeah. That's not quite as obvious. Now, the question becomes, of course, as you pointed out, how do you connect those? How do you actually even get there? Right. And the point I would look at is I would look at my business very holistically. And if you look at your business from a consumer's perspective, strong consumer's perspective, you can ask questions around, okay, so I'm making craft beer, but it's not just I'm making craft beer. My consumer also consumes craft beer. Right. And when you get there, then you can get into like questions. Okay, so if I have consumers who are going and drink craft beer when they're downtown out partying, what does the surrounding like environment look like for them, right? Yeah. So they need to get from A to B, they need to get home, etc. And then you can actually kind of reverse engineer your way towards that self-driving car.
Okay, that makes total sense. I want to jump back to COVID because I'm guilty of saying over and over again, it's the mother of all disruptors, right? We as entrepreneurs, we want to be the disruptors in the marketplace, and suddenly the world as a whole was universally disrupted. And I've moved away from that term, and I've moved towards it was really more of an accelerator. So having to talk to other thought leaders like yourself, one of the things that kept coming up and again is that COVID accelerated a lot of trends that were already in the process of happening. So we'll take working remotely, right? So that's something that, was nothing new, but suddenly overnight businesses that were reticent to it suddenly welcomed it and realized, oh, wait, there's actually benefits. And also there's new negatives, right? There's things that we hadn't even considered before. What's your take on how COVID has kind of reshaped businesses individually at large?
It's a super fascinating question. And I think you're right. We talked a lot about like how COVID essentially took certain industries, certain behaviors, certain adoption of technologies, for example, and literally fast forward them by 5 or 10 years. Right. Remote work, without a doubt, like the whole like video conferencing thing, it changed certain behaviors, etc. Without a doubt. The two interesting questions I'm asking myself with COVID, and I don't think the jury is quite in yet, is how lasting will those changes be? So, for example, I remember in the midst of the pandemic, people were like, nobody will ever go back to the office. Like, this is so much better. And now, we see, companies wanting to have people back in the office, employees wanting to be back in the office, right? So the other one for me is travel, which is, COVID basically destroyed travel, no doubt. And now we're seeing this thing which they call actually revenge travel.
Pent up demand, we were like because
pent up demand, and there's an interesting question of like, what will be the new normal, and I don't think that is actually quite clear yet. And again, like an incredible opportunity for entrepreneurs who are nimble to like play flexibly with like what will the new ways, the new normals be. Now, granted, I think some things due to COVID will have shifted pretty dramatically. So we saw, for example, without surprise, a huge uptick in home deliveries for groceries, for example.
Right.
And I believe once you have experienced the benefit, the convenience of home delivery, You will probably, you will probably not do every shopping in a home delivery environment, but you will do way more of those.
Right.
So there clearly is like a bumping. One thing I want to point out, because that is what people don't talk a lot about. In some areas, COVID also has been a massive decelerator. I'll give you one example. So we work with the AICPA, the American Institute for CPAs. That's basically the body which bestows the CPA credential.
Okay.
Pre-COVID, the blockchain was a massive topic for them. It was this whole thing about like, oh my God, like, we'll put all the records on the blockchain. And there's good reasons for that. Then COVID came along. And during COVID time, all the CPAs, they were struggling with like doing your PPPs, like this American program to get cash from the government. They were just like barely, they were fighting. And what this did is that nobody was talking about the blockchain. They were all like, yeah, we can talk about the blockchain when I can breathe again.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting thing where the blockchain in this particular profession, in this particular moment in time, actually has been decelerated. It has been put on the back burner and has been slowed down by at least 2-3 years. So COVID works both ways.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's a good illustration that the reality is every reaction probably has a pro and a negative reaction. And it's good due diligence to make sure you're appreciating both sides of that coin, because one could be more impactful than the other. Let's talk about a world of abundance. So seeing you speak on this topic in a world where we have so much accessible to us in any instance, as you mentioned, home delivery, all these different things that it's convenient based. How do businesses try to stand out in this world of, really it just feels like you're a grain of sand in a world of beaches?
It's a good question. I think the point I like to make here is to think about this less as abundance, much more about the commoditization of everything.
Okay.
And the way we like to think about this goes back to, I have a background in software, so I think a little bit in these like weird software terms. But if you know anything about software, there's this idea about what they call the stack. So there's an operating system, and then on top of that operating system is an application system, and then on top of that application and database system, and then on top is like your particular database and your particular system, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And what we've seen over the last literally decades is that more and more and more of this stack becomes commoditized. So more and more of that stack becomes standardized. Like you would never dream of writing your own operating system. You just use Windows or Mac OS, or Linux or whatever. So what happens is two things. There is a set of companies which actually specialize. There's three types of companies. There's companies which specialize in creating value at the very top of the stack. And I can give you examples of like this idea, the commoditization, the stackification of the world happens in every industry. We see it everywhere. So you've got companies which actually create the value at the very, very top of the stack. So I give you an example. We talked about craft beer. Yeah. I know a bunch of craft beer brewers who actually don't have brewing capacity. They just rent the capacity from other big brewing companies. Okay. So their value add is essentially the recipe. They don't grow their hop, they don't grow their malt, they don't like none of that stuff. Yeah. Their edge truly is only their like specific recipe and their marketing and the brand around this, right? So they're at the very top of that stack where they operate. And we find these companies doing really, really well. They tend to be niche-y, like you tend to be somewhat limited in your capacity. Then you've got a few select companies which have the CapEx, OpEx ability to own more and more of that stack. Yeah. And they're basically deeply vertically integrated. The classic example in the tech industry, clearly Apple. They're making their own chips now, their own silicon, right? Yeah, right. In the beer industry, AB InBev. AB InBev goes so far, this is like, for me, is mind-bending. They not only have their own glass-making facility, so they make their own bottles, they have their own sand pit where they get the sand to make the glass. And the reason why they do this is because they make such volumes that it actually makes sense for them that they can squeeze out a little bit of like margin out of these like pieces, right? Yeah. Tesla is another interesting example in the car industry where you have a deeply vertically integrated company. Like they make their own batteries, they write their own software, they make their own chips, they make their own cars, of course, etc. And then you've got a third type of companies, which are the people who make the pieces, who build the stack, right? So who build these infrastructural pieces. In the world of e-commerce, you've got companies like Shopify, for example, which makes online stores, or Stripe, which makes payments. So we see essentially whatever the word is for three things, instead of bifurcation. I actually don't know what the word is. Like a triple.
We'll go with trifurcation. Yeah,
trifurcation. A trifurcation. Yeah. So you see a trifurcation of the world, and I think one of the challenges established businesses sometimes have is that they tend to be not big enough to vertically integrate, and they tend to be too they tend to be too fat to like really play at the very top. They've got too much of the stuff where they don't have a competitive advantage.
So what's your take? Because I think that that's going to be the majority of businesses, at least that are listening to this. What's your take to kind of internalize that, I guess, that realization to restructure, reorg, repurpose to become more nimble, to be able to adapt and, capture those riches in the niches?
I like to sit down with entrepreneurs and basically say, draw a chart or whatever graphic you want of what's your value chain. Like, what is the stuff you do? Like, what does it take to make your product and bring it to your customer, sell it to your customer, service your customer, etc. And then you get these like little boxes and whatever it is, like a flow chart or something. And then you can look at each one of those and say, first of all, do we have a competitive advantage here? So do we actually have an advantage in, say, for example, running our homemade e-commerce solution versus, getting something from like Shopify, for example? Sometimes you might find areas where you don't have an advantage, but you have a consumer advantage. Classic example here is if you do pick, pack, and ship. For many companies, I would argue you probably can't do pick, pack, and ship better than a specialized company. Right. But it might give you an advantage where if you do it, particularly crafty and you put little notes in for your customers or little sweets and whatever customer delight you can create, which you couldn't do with an outsourced solution. Right. You create an advantage. So I like to do that exercise and literally take a really hard look and say, where are we better than the competition? Either because we can make it cheaper, better, more interesting, novel. Or where we can create a moment of delight or customer bonding or, these kind of things.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that, aside from all the insight I've gotten working on this show, I think one of the underlying principles that I've seen is this customer experience and how widely it has been ignored. Not only just from, the product or the service interaction, but what is the pre-experience? What is the during? What is the post-experience? All of these different intricate aspects that I think a lot of businesses really just take for second, just really leave it on the side. So taking that opportunity to realize, okay, we don't have the bandwidth, so now we need to look at that customer experience. What is the process that you would recommend? Because I've heard you talk about this disruption, right? Disruption doesn't happen in the lab. Happens in the go-to-market space. And so obviously it's not either or because you're doing stuff in the lab, but what are the recommendations within the lab experience for you, for businesses that they can apply to decide if they're moving in the right direction?
The invitation I always have to people, and I always tell this as a story to relate this, is you look at an iPhone. When the iPhone came out 2007, it was by far the most expensive phone you could possibly buy. It had a bunch of things like the battery life in comparison to a Nokia phone was like a joke. Like a Nokia had a 2-week battery life. An iPhone you needed to recharge every 8 hours. Yeah, right. The voice quality of the calls was actually not that great in comparison to the Nokia phones, etc. So many things actually spoke against it. Okay. But clearly also many things spoke for it, right? Like a different user interface, like the idea that you have a computer in your pocket, all these kind of things. I believe the winning part for Apple is Apple would have used the same distribution channel as Nokia and Samsung and anyone else who made phones, which was, if you go back in memory, it was a terrible experience buying a phone. You walked into these stores and it's like the people just wanted to push phones on you, like just want to get a contract and they get incentivized by the carriers and so on. It's like terrible, like about as bad as buying a car. And Apple didn't do this, right? Apple said, we have a different product. We need to bring it to market differently. So what we do is we put it into these beautifully designed stores where there is not a salesperson, but a genius who's not there to sell, but to really explain this thing to you. And I think that's a genius move. That's a really smart move on this Apple. So I wish companies would, when they think about whatever they're doing today and or thinking about what they're going to do in the future, really sit down and say, how do we create actually a meaningful customer interaction, customer delight at these different pieces in the contact chain, as you mentioned, starts with a big, like, even pre-purchase.
Yeah.
And really, quite frankly, you can do incredible innovation and bond your customer to your product.
Let's talk about the disruption wheel. I want to know if there's a process as you go out and you put all of these, kind of decision trees. Is there a process to go backwards, maybe a year down the road, and say, hey, let's look at what we did in this annual forecasting. Let's see where we went wrong so that we continually, I guess, are trying to hone the knife. So every time we do this further, it's a more accurate cut or forecast.
I think you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what you want to do. I think it's important to essentially stay with the program. So I give you a simple example. So I used to be at Google when we released Google Glass, which were these augmented reality glasses, which were a total disaster. Of course, commercially, total disaster.
Yep.
It's very easy. Yeah, right? It's very easy to look at them and say, oh, they're not good, and then just dismiss the whole topic and basically put it aside.
Yeah.
What I think is really important is once you find something you find interesting, let's say, these augmented reality glasses, you might even run one of these disruption map exercises where you look at what does the world look like when these things become real? Because there will be a lot of change and opportunity, of course. But then to continuously revisit this topic. So what I would do is I would literally put it, whatever, like write it on a piece of paper, if that's your mojo, but go back to it every 3 months and say, where does the world look like? What does the world look like at the moment? Like, what are we? What has happened since I last looked at this?
Yeah.
And it starts, what it does, and you said this really, really nicely, it starts to essentially sharpen your knife. Like you get, it hones your skill. I mean, if you do it regularly, you become really good at actually seeing these trends and like very quickly sussing out like, okay, there's a new development, like a new system, a new product came out. What does this actually mean? Like, how close is it to you right there? I highly recommend like running those loops, those regular loops, and take some time out of your regularly scheduled business and think about the future.
Okay. I mean, it makes sense that if you're not going to do that, you probably shouldn't start it in the first place, right? Because if you're not refining it, if you're not making it better, I mean, I guess there's a practical exercise to do it, but I do feel like that closes the loop, and that businesses a lot of times start, but they don't follow through with it, and therefore it was wasted energy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's also a tendency, so in defense of the mental model of saying like, oh, like let's close the books. I think there's a tendency to look at something saying it's not good and just basically close the books there, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I looked at the metaverse, it's like,
it's not for me.
It's garbage, like, ignore. And I think that's, I get where it comes from, but I think it's dangerous to do because these things get better and they become more interesting and, things happen.
Well, the world changes internally and externally. So, all right, I want to move into what we call the Quickfire round. Same questions we asked all of our guests. It's just a great way to get different flavors, different colors. Do you have a favorite podcast that you're listening to right now, aside from yours?
I personally, I don't listen to my own voice. Okay. I can't listen to my voice. That's terrible. I really like Azim Azar's work. He's a British gentleman. He does a lot of future thinking, has a very nuanced view, a very little bit academic view on the future.
Okay, perfect. Let's talk about your favorite professional inspiration.
Oh my God, professional inspiration. Jesus, that is not a rapid fire question. That's something I actually need to think about. In terms of professional inspiration, I find the most inspiring, most interesting conversations I have with people who are as far away from my anything which is me, my professional background, my personal background, my ethnicity, my age. I love talking with a teenager in Lincoln, Nebraska, who is from a lower social demographic class and just asking them a question about like, how do you use the internet? How do you see the world? What's happening?
Yeah.
Because I found those conversations richest because they see things I have no idea about and I would never see.
I love that. I'm a big believer. You don't know what you don't know. And if you just stay in your bubble, it's just such a shallow kind of, environment. Next one, favorite book.
That's a really good question. So, in terms of books, I have a tendency to like start books a lot, and then like I've got this whole pile of like I read the first 30 pages, and then I never get to it.
Guilty.
Probably my attention span is too short. In terms of books, one book I come back again and again and again, and it's more like in the like yourself like actualization space.
Sure.
Is from Stephen Pressfield. He wrote a very small book, maybe that's the reason why I like it, called Do the Work.
Okay.
And it's really beautiful, inspirational, and so true.
Okay. So it's got to be strong if it's a short book, but very powerful. Early riser or burning the midnight oil?
Definitely early riser.
Okay. All right. Same here.
Loud
All right.
and clear.
So I want to move into back into the disruption space. You have a very interesting take on what the difference between innovation and disruption is. So I wanted to open that up to you to kind of share that.
It goes back to Clayton Christensen, the godfather of disruptive innovation. But I think it's important to distinguish because there's innovation, and we tend to use those terms interchangeably, and I think it's dangerous to do so. So innovation is ultimately you make something which exists and you make it a little bit better. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with innovation. The bread and butter of your business is innovation. So classic example is, going back to mobile phones, going back to Nokia. Like every year you bring out a new model. It's a little bit better. Battery life is a little bit better. Voice quality is better, whatever it is. It's a little smaller. And then you've got disruption. And disruption is when you do something, you solve an existing customer need. It's important to understand because those customer needs tend to be very, very durable. You solve an existing customer need in a very different way. Okay. So you go from banking in a branch with speaking to a human to going to bank in the comfort of your house using your phone. That is a very disruptive tendency because the challenge with disruption is, again, the underlying consumer need is unchanged. You want to, do your banking. You want to have insight into your financial, into your financials, etc. But what happens is that when you go from one of those, we call them states. When you go from one of those states to the next, that for the incumbent, the existing company, all of your existing processes and resources you deployed, they become irrelevant. And it's a really dangerous part, right? Like if you're a bank and you've got 200 bank branches and nobody wants to go to the branch anymore because they're doing it on the phone, you happen to end up with 200 branches and people working in those branches. And more importantly, your particular knowledge about how do you actually run the branch, where do you put one of your next branches, et cetera, becomes obsolete. And that's a really tricky thing to overcome. So I think it's really important to distinguish those two. Innovation is way more common, way more. Yeah. 95% of your work, 98% of your work is innovation. Disruption, when it occurs, tends to be, indeed, to use the word, to be very disruptive to your business.
So let's talk about this. I had a guest on, and he was talking about basically pandemic level company saving measures. And one of the things that he's always recommended, or at least advocated for, is that every company, at least of a certain size, should have a kamikaze team. And that team's business, or at least role in the organization, is trying to defeat the business, right? Mm-hmm. Like they're literally trying to come at it. What's your take on that? Like how should organizations like try to internalize like, oh no, we're just being innovative versus no, we want to be disruptive.
Yeah. I love this. I mean, there's also the red team exercise where you got like the special forces like taking you down. I love the idea. And I think it's a great practice. The challenge with that is what do you make out of the results coming from there? Okay. And this is where I think the reality hits hits hard because many businesses simply don't know what to do with that. We get disrupted. What do we do, right? and then they kill the Kamikaze team, right? They fire them or like assign them to something else. Every once in a while, you actually have then the Kamikaze teams becoming like super frustrated and just basically like go out, fundraise, and kill their mothership, right? I've seen that happen.
Yeah, right.
Other types of businesses take that information and say, how do I protect myself from that, right? So how do I build a moat around this castle I have, which protects me from this particular attack vector, which I think to a certain extent, like every once in a while it works, but most of the time it's very futile and it's a complete waste of resources. And then a very few select companies, typically if they have very good leadership, they're taking the information they got from their Kamikaze team and say, okay, now we're going to build this. We're going to actually disrupt ourselves. It requires, quite frankly, it requires insanely good leadership. It requires leaders who are really willing to go down that rather painful path of rebuilding the business, right? And, face it, like most, no disrespect, but most leaders, I don't think want to do that because it's uncomfortable. It's hard. It's,
scary.
It's risky. It's scary. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Okay. I want to talk about some disruptors, and this is just kind of free form. There's no right or wrong, but these are some ones that just jumped to the top of my mind as I put this together today. But first one, Elon Musk taking over Twitter. That's a hell of a disruption, and it's interesting from a lot of different angles. But I'd love to just hear your take on it.
Oh man, how do I say this nicely?
You can say it however you want to.
So I've got the biggest type of respect for Elon Musk. I think what he's done with lots of his business, not all of his business, but lots of his business, like take the Starlink, the SpaceXs, the Teslas, of course, is phenomenal. I mean, it's truly, truly disruptive. It's a really interesting way to like go about your business. The Twitter thing, to be honest, feels to me like you have a very rich kid playing in a playground and being very jealous that they can't play with that nice blue elephant, which this other kid has. So they're going to buy, well, it's not a blue elephant, it's a blue bird, right? Yeah. The little blue bird. So they're going to buy the blue bird because they can.
Yeah.
I tell you a funny story. It's like, it reminded me to, I was at Google, and some of you might remember this. Google actually at one point acquired the mobile phone business from Motorola. Yeah. And Google owned that business for, I don't know, like maybe a year, and then sold it again. And the internal joke at Google, so this is an internal here, was that someone, Larry Page and Sergey Brin went to like their underlings and said, go get me a Motorola. And then the underlings went and bought Motorola. And the Twitter thing feels to me like, Elon Musk's just like, go buy me a Twitter,
Well, so this bleeds into the next one, which is kind of social media as a whole, right? And there's a lot of different flavors, right? You can pick the one, I love Instagram because I'm into photography, right? So it's perfect for me. I used to really like Facebook, but then Facebook got super political. So I'm able to choose and I'm able to bounce between the different platforms that I like. I do think that there's a giant question mark about how social media evolves in society, because how we act in the social, environment versus how we act in the physical. If I was to be standing with you, drinking a craft beer with you right now, the conversations can a lot of times be different. So what's your take on how the evolution of kind of social media continues to evolve?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think we need to get into the whole systemic bias and like algorithmic bias challenges we have with like platforms like Facebook. Just look at The Social Dilemma, the documentary. It's on Netflix. Amazing and scary.
Yes.
That all being said, I think it's interesting to see what actually happens in social media at the moment, because you see clearly when you look at younger demographics, it's a massive move away from Facebook. They don't use Facebook anymore.
Yeah.
They're on Instagram. On Instagram, they actually curate their Instagram feeds in really interesting ways. So you might have seen they have often younger folks have multiple Instagram feeds. They're all set to private. They might have one public one, which they very, very carefully curate. It's a really interesting way to like use social media. And then, of course, TikTok. So getting to like super short form video content, curated by an incredibly, incredibly good AI, which shows you, whatever the AI thinks is your next like hit, your dopamine hit, right?
Right.
And then what I find is interesting is like there seems to be a splintering. So we see many, many more subcultures like splintering in like subgroups. Reddit is this interesting social network. A lot of people don't really talk about. But it's a lot happening. And then, of course, you've got Reddit's ugly sibling, which is 4chan, which is really like the dark corner, one of the darker corners of the internet.
Right.
So that all being said, I think there's a distinction. There's a very interesting distinction for me between people who grew up natively on the internet. So kids who are, like the Gen Zs, kids who like all their memories is to have a smartphone and to be online and do things versus, you and I, where, I grew up in a world where there was no internet, literally no internet.
Yeah.
And I think the usage and the way we interact on these media is very different from generation to generation. And I think you can literally bifurcate the world into like, there is a social media world, which is the Gen Z social media world. Mm-hmm. And then there's the one which we hear a lot about, because you and I, like the common, like what we hear in the press and see is this like, with all due respect, the old people's internet.
Fair. So speaking of old versus young, let's talk about crypto versus traditional banking. Obviously, well, not obviously. So I think it's fascinating. I've been a fan for a few years. And I think what's happened in the past 3-6 months where crypto has really tanked, at least how it was positioned to me earlier, it was actually supposed to kind of be the anti-inflation. It was supposed to be the anti-influenced, and yet it was heavily influenced. And as you talked about earlier, as far as accounting groups, right? Mm-hmm. Relying on the blockchain, using that as a centralized place, or well, I guess decentralized, but still centralized as far as the source of truth. What's your vision of the future of crypto?
I think it's complicated. I think what we're currently seeing in crypto is really a lot of like the birthing challenges of any new technology. It's like there's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of like nonsensical stuff out there. You see a lot of these cryptocurrencies. I mean, a beautiful example for me is Dogecoin, which is one of those cryptocurrencies which is named and was built after an internet meme with a Shiba Inu, whatever. Yeah, a dog, basically. Yep. The creator of Dogecoin basically created this as a joke. Dogecoin to this day has like billions and billions of dollars of market cap, which just goes to show that there is a lot of like weirdness going on here. So I do believe that there's, in the principles of it and in the underlying technologies, we will see really interesting innovations. I don't believe that what we're currently seeing is even remotely what it's going to be in like 10, 20 years. Okay. One point I think I always find interesting to hear is, and I thought this from the very beginning when people told me, like, you look at Bitcoin or Ethereum or something and just basically say, particular Bitcoin. Ethereum is a little bit different because it has an interesting utility because you can program it. Yes, right. Bitcoin is purely a value store. Yeah. And you look at Bitcoin and people said like, oh, it's going to be like deflationary. It's like, it's decoupled from currencies. The problem with Bitcoin is it has inherently zero value. And then the counter argument was always, well, the dollar has zero value. It's just paper being printed by a government. But there's an interesting difference here, which is, at least as long as like the vast majority of people believes in government in general, there's at least the US government behind the US dollar, versus Bitcoin truly is a fabricated, creation of the mind without nobody behind it. Like there's nothing behind it. So I think it's a little trickier, and that's the reason I think why you see the volatility and the coupling of Bitcoin to the markets at the moment. Now, that being said, if you live in Argentina, for example, where you've got like 60% inflation rate, things like Bitcoin become a very different play. Right.
So then, and you might have just answered it, but the follow-up question I had as you were talking through that is, do you feel the future of crypto is more in the utility-based aspects, such as Ethereum, where you can build, applications and things, or do you feel that it's more in the currency side of things for those, unbankable, individuals of the world kind of thing? Or is it really just semi-parallel paths, just using different goals?
I think it's a bit of the latter. I think there's something interesting in there, which is, at the moment, the challenge you have with crypto is that, particularly if you look at something like Bitcoin, it's of course very energy intensive because of the particular algorithms which run on it to create the scarcity, etc. Once you get over this, once you build systems which are not on scale shift towards a different model, which will be significantly more energy efficient and quicker, faster.
Sure.
I think you actually can bring down the transaction cost. So if you bring down the transaction cost, you suddenly can offer banking products for people who couldn't afford a bank. There's a whole bunch of like really interesting innovation happening here. So again, my view on this is we get blindsided a little bit by looking at what's happening right now. And you look at, I don't know, like an NFT, and you either believe that you should put your 401k into a Bored Ape NFT because it will go up to 10 million, or you think it's the dumbest thing on the planet. Same goes for Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of those cryptocurrencies. And I don't think we know even remotely where this goes. There's an interesting question around rules and regulations. Yeah. Right. So the question of like, what does an SEC do with this? What does an IRS do? And they start to do a few things. But I think once we get like more maturity in those markets, then these products and the services will become significantly more interesting.
Okay. Last question. What do you see as the next biggest challenge?
For humanity at large, climate change, without a doubt.
Okay.
And I can tell you, like, the thing which was for me the true wake up call. I mean, clearly, like we've been talking about climate change for a while now, and I think we should all be like awakened to it. But I have friends in India, and they live in the region which is currently just hammered by high temperatures. Mm-hmm. And they sent me video of literally birds falling dead out of the sky. Because they're cooking. They're basically, they can't survive. Right. And there's an interesting research paper which recently came out where they looked at the human's ability to survive high temperatures, and essentially revised down what was commonly accepted as the upper level of temperature rise. So there's a piece in there where we'll see, chunks of this planet essentially inhabitable to humans. Right. And that scares the shit out of me. I have to say, because like that can create such interesting and dramatic runaway effects where I really think we can tackle this. Humans can tackle this stuff, but we need to make the choice to do so. We need to actually do something.
Yeah, it was actually going to be one of my questions, was a climate-based one, as far as what's your vision of the future. But I do think that it's a very pivotal challenge that we all face. And I think, to your point, I think we're capable of overcoming anything. It's just, are we going to be motivated to do it? And I guess, putting this kind of semi-full circle, I do think it's a great exercise for every business to do this, disruption map as far as how it could potentially interrupt their business. Because there's definitely, I think we're starting to see more dominoes fall that have a direct impact, whereas before it just seemed, it was a buzzword. Right? Mm-hmm. Climate change, global warming, and that's all it was. And even if we saw little things, it didn't necessarily impact us, but I think that's going to become less and less of an option for businesses moving forward.
Agree. Absolutely agree, yeah.
Okay, well, Pascal, I love this. It's a very interesting conversation. Looking forward, so many times some of us just stuck in the now, but definitely you got to put your head up and look forward and try to see what other options, what other challenges are in front of you, which is why it's been such a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. And this was a great conversation. And yeah, everybody who's listening, watching, just go build the future. It's yours. I like it. We'll have you on again soon. Thank you. Thanks, Pascal. Well, that wraps up today's episode with Ask an Expert, Pascal Finette. I'm really excited. We had a great time talking about the future. We had a great time talking about how you can use real-world exercises to help kind of forecast and plot out your future. So I hope you learned a lot today. And like always, we hope that what you learned can help propel your business forward.